Graham Hancock is a former journalist who switched to writing pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history in support of his ideas about Atlantis, which he believes was a real ancient historical nation with advanced technology and a global reach, spreading civilization across the planet. Dan Richards of the DeDunking YouTube channel is a self-described alternate historian and pseudo-archaeologist who doesn't agree with all of Hancock's ideas, but has a similar view on Atlantis. Dan recognizes that Hancock's work has material which has not aged well and is not only wrong, but has also been used to justify racist narratives. However, he attempts to mitigate this to some extent by arguing that in some cases Hancock was just misled by views which were perfectly acceptable at the time he was writing his books and were even mainstream views in academia. One example he provides is Hancock's use of the story that when the Spanish arrived in South America, the Aztecs interpreted them as gods on the basis of religious myths they had of white gods with beards and great wisdom who had once taught them and would one day return from over the seas. In an 11th of December 2023 video entitled Racist, Atlantis Hunting is Rooted in White Supremacy, Dan says, quote, "But when he does talk about the white civilizer gods in South America that Cortez supposedly was able to piggyback, the old Quetzalcoatl Viracocha thing, that is something that has been recently debunked. And people point out that, hey man, you know the Spanish probably changed those myths, but that wasn't something that was taught until recently, until very recently. So when Hancock wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia, there's no way for him to have stumbled across it, alright? It's not like he could just go Google it and get on Google Scholar. It's the freaking 90s, man. Early 90s." End quote. This is an example of why people who aren't qualified or educated in a field should seek the advice and knowledge of those who are. Firstly, it is untrue that the Spanish corruption of this myth wasn't taught until recently. And secondly, this information could have been found by Hancock even in the early 90s. Hancock uses outdated sources. In his 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, Hancock wrote that the Incas, quote, "legends and religious beliefs made them so certain of his physical type," that's Quetzalcoatl, that they initially mistook the white and bearded Spaniards who arrived on their shores for the returning Viracocha and his demigods, an event long prophesied, and which Viracocha was said in all the legends to have promised, end quote. Fortunately, Hancock has a footnote identifying his source for this information, and it's, quote, "J. Alden Mason, The Ancient Civilizations of Peru, Penguin Books, London, 1991, page 135, end quote. This looks pretty good. John Alden Mason was a respectable archaeologist and anthropologist, and his book was published by Penguin Books, a good quality trade press, in 1991, just a few years before Hancock published his own work. So it really looks like Dan was correct. Hancock was using a current academic source of his time, representing mainstream scholarly views, so Hancock can't be faulted for including this false information in his book. However, if we do some actual research, we find the facts aren't quite what they appear to be. The 1991 publication of Mason's book was just a reprint of the original edition, also published by Penguin Books, and that was published in 1957. So when Hancock was reading Mason's book, he wasn't actually reading a work of current scholarship, he was reading a work of scholarship from almost 40 years earlier. Hancock doesn't tell us this, and nor does Dan, and I'm not even sure if either of them was aware of the fact. It certainly doesn't look like either of them did the work necessary to check the source. You might think that Hancock could be forgiven for believing this work was current scholarship, given the publication date, but since he was a journalist for nearly 20 years, it's reasonable to expect him to do proper research and check his sources. A 1991 hard copy publication of this work would include publication details identifying it as a reprint and would include the original publication date. However, even Mason doesn't say anything about the Spaniards being misidentified because they were white and bearded. He simply says the Inca emperor, quote, "presumed that the Spaniards were the creator god Viracocha and his demigods returning as had been prophesied by old legends," end quote. Hancock provides another reference for his claim in the same footnote, writing, quote, "See also Garcilaso de la Vega, The Royal Commentaries of the Incas, Orion Press, New York, 1961, end quote. This work is only slightly later than Mason's 1957 book, so still nothing like current scholarship at the time Hancock was writing. But again, with a little research, we find the situation is worse than it appears, because Hancock doesn't tell readers this is a 1961 publication of the original work by Garcilaso de la Vega, written in 1609. This is actually one of the 17th century Spanish works responsible for perpetuating misleading information about the Inca myths in the first place. Earlier on the same page, Hancock cites two sources to substantiate his claim that Peruvian depictions of the Inca god Viracocha, quote, made him sound like a Caucasian, end quote. This time, the sources he cites are explicitly old. He gives dates of 1968 and 1964, respectively, not remotely current at the time he was writing. The book published in 1968 was written by Harold Osborn, who was not an archaeologist, anthropologist, or historian. He studied human aesthetics. The other work, with the bold title Fair Gods and Stone Faces, was originally published in 1963, written by Constance H. Frick Irwin. Irwin was a qualified journalist and librarian, but not an archaeologist, anthropologist, or historian. Her book is described in a 1965 review in a scholarly journal as, quote, the latest attempt to demonstrate the transoceanic origins of Native American civilizations, end quote. The review is highly critical, noting, quote, the various ways in which cultural elements are pulled out of context, end quote, and, quote, lack of knowledge, end quote, and, quote, chronological confusion, end quote. This is a very bad source. Remember, Dan doesn't tell you any of this. He just tells you Hancock's error should be overlooked since it wasn't his fault. He was just citing information which was presented in mainstream academic publications of the time. But is that actually true? Let's take a look. Hancock could have used better sources. It's true the claims Hancock makes about the reception of the Spanish arrival in South America could be found in some scholarly works around the time Hancock was writing, and certainly earlier, though often even those claims were accompanied by expressions of doubt. Enrique Orozco's 1980 work, Republican Protestantism in Aztlan, comments, quote, although we are of the opinion that his real image was significantly distorted through oral transmission over the centuries, both Spanish chroniclers and Indian legend described Quetzalcoatl as a tall, white-bearded person, end quote. However, as we will see, this view had already been discredited by scholarship years before, and the view that the white Quetzalcoatl was a Spanish fabrication was not only well established in academia well before Hancock was writing, but had even found its way into non-academic popular books readily available to the public. Back in 1971, anthropologist B.C. Hedrick responded to the idea that belief in the god Quetzalcoatl had been inspired by a white European man who visited the Americas bringing knowledge and technology. He noted, quote, as some manuscripts have, indeed, described him, he was bearded, light-skinned, end quote, which appears to support Hancock's claim. However, although Hedrick's paper does not engage with the accuracy of Quetzalcoatl's physical description in these myths, he does engage directly with the question of whether or not Quetzalcoatl had been a white European, as Hancock would later claim. Hedrick's paper examines the relevant evidence in detail and concludes that, although the myth of Quetzalcoatl was inspired by a real man, Quetzalcoatl himself was not European, but, quote, was indigenous to the New World beyond any reasonable doubt, end quote. For Hedrick, even the references to white skin in some of the sources describing Quetzalcoatl did not identify him as non-indigenous. So already in 1971, Hedrick had comprehensively answered the question of whether Quetzalcoatl was inspired by a white European, an idea Hancock would promote over 20 years later. In the same book as Hedrick's work was published, geographer Clinton R. Edwards observed that Hedrick was not attempting to disprove the idea that Europeans had arrived in the Americas before Columbus, but, quote, with demonstrating that if such did occur, the person who became deified as Quetzalcoatl had nothing to do with them, end quote. Most importantly, Edwards noted, quote, Hedrick means to quash once and for all the many attempts to invoke an old-world bearded white god with entourage as bearers of civilization and origin of the Quetzalcoatl tradition." End quote. Edwards further wrote, with great approval, quote, "I do not believe that most serious, knowledgeable students of American prehistory will feel the need for Quetzalcoatl's establishment as an indigene, but now, at least, they have a well-argued and relatively short and succinct essay to which they can refer those avid questioners whose imaginations have been fired by more romantic versions of Quetzalcoatl's origin." End quote. This is significant because it shows that all the way back in 1971, quote, "the most serious, knowledgeable students of American prehistory," end quote, already understood that Quetzalcoatl was indigenous, not a historical memory of a white European who had visited the Americas in the distant past, and that view was typically held by, quote, "those avid questioners whose imaginations have been fired by more romantic versions of Quetzalcoatl's origin," end quote, such as the alternative history and pseudo-archaeology communities. So all the way back in 1971, Hancock's belief that Quetzalcoatl was evidence for a white Atlantean people arriving in the Americas and civilizing the natives with their advanced knowledge and technology had already been dismissed by academics in the field. Why doesn't Dan say this in his video? Probably because he simply didn't know, and Hancock very likely didn't know either. But let's look in more detail at the part of Hancock's argument which Hedrick didn't address directly, the idea that there were historical records identifying Quetzalcoatl as looking like a white European. According to Dan, this idea was still current in mainstream scholarship at the time Hancock was writing in the early 90s, and wasn't discredited until later. Additionally, Dan claims that at the time Hancock wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, he couldn't have been better informed, quote, "unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia. There's no way for him to have stumbled across it," end quote. Is this true? No, it isn't. Let's look at the book Secrets of Mayan Science and Religion by Hunbat's Men, a Mayan daykeeper, a specialist on Mayan timekeeping and the sacred and symbolic meanings of time in Mayan culture. Men states explicitly, quote, "self-appointed official historians have created the great colonial lie of the white, bearded, and blue-eyed Quetzalcoatl, a deception still perpetrated in histories of our beloved Mexican people," end quote. Was Men's book published early enough for Hancock to use it in 1995? Yes, Men's book was published in 1990. Okay, but where was it published? Was this a work of high academia, accessible only to the scholarly elite, locked behind a university firewall or a publisher paywall? No, it was a cheap $14.95 paperback, first available on sale in 1989, published by Inner Traditions, a small trade press specializing in works on spiritualism, mysticism, astrology, the occult, alternative history, pseudo-archaeology, alternative medicine, and related subjects. In fact, just the same kind of material as Hancock's own books. Occasionally, they publish works on more mainstream topics too. The point is, if the information discrediting the white bearded Quetzalcoatl was already available in 1990 in a cheap and readily available book published by a very average trade press, written by an author who was qualified to comment on the topic, it can't be argued that this information was inaccessible to Hancock when writing Fingerprints of the Gods 5 years later. We've already seen that Hancock's view of this topic wasn't informed by the scholarship of his time anyway, since he was relying on sources from up to 50 years earlier. But he had no excuse for doing so. Better sources were available to him. He just didn't use them. Remember, Dan claims that the fact that the white-bearded Quetzalcoatl was a Spanish invention was only, quote, recently debunked, end quote, and that there was no way for Hancock to have found this information, quote, unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia. There's no way for him to have stumbled across it, end quote. Dan didn't provide any evidence for his claim, and we can already see his claim is false. But what were scholars saying on this topic around the time Hancock was writing Fingerprints of the Gods? In 1989, archaeologist and anthropologist Susan D. Gillespie wrote that the Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas was the great propagator of the white god legend, end quote, not Incan myth. In 1986, anthropologist Brant Gardner wrote in a journal article, quote, "Perhaps the most confusing aspect of the myth is the reference to a white Quetzalcoatl. The idol of the god was always painted black, and I know of no native or even early Spanish text which specifically mentions a white skin. I have been unable to find the point at which this concept enters the legend, but it is clearly not a part of the important information which described Quetzalcoatl at the time of the conquest," end quote. Gardner was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, who have traditionally had a deep interest in the history of the Americas, and his work was published in a Mormon journal, further demonstrating that before Hancock was writing, this fact was already well known beyond the confines of elite academia. In 1984, Professor of History William H. Steibing Jr., who frequently engaged and replied to alternate history theories in his writings, wrote that while in mythology Quetzalcoatl, quote, is often described as having a flowing beard, end quote, quote, the early Spaniards publicized a variant of the tradition in which the god had a white skin and was expected to return in human form, end quote. Steibing also explained, quote, the idea that Quetzalcoatl had a white skin may have arisen among Montezuma and his advisors to explain the landing of white bearded strangers from the east. The Spaniards then made use of this interpretation of the Quetzalcoatl legend for their own purposes. But Quetzalcoatl was not generally regarded as a white-skinned deity, end quote. Thus, back in 1984, Steibing was dismissing the view Hancock would promote a decade later. It's worth noting that although Steibing was an emeritus professor of history, this book of his wasn't an elite academic work unavailable to the public. It was printed by Prometheus Press, a small and very average trade press specializing in works on skepticism, critical thinking, humanism, and free thought. John Humphrey Ireland's 1972 book, The Dispossessed Majority, is another non-academic work dismissing the white Quetzalcoatl myth. Written under the pen name Wilmot Robertson, revised and reprinted in a second edition in 1973 and 1976, reprinted in a third edition from 1981 to 1984, and reprinted in a fourth revised edition in 1996, this book is significant for the topic under investigation, since Ireland was a right-wing white nationalist who believed in a hierarchy of races and wrote his book to promote the idea that America's conservative majority had been disenfranchised and oppressed by an elite liberal minority through multiculturalism, civil rights, and desegregation. Ireland argued that one line of evidence for the superiority of what he categorized as the Aryan race was that cultures around the world found physical whiteness attractive, and he provided what he regarded as clear examples of this. However, even this unashamedly racist author hesitated to use the story of a white Quetzalcoatl, saying this was, quote, more tenuous, end quote, adding in a footnote, quote, other investigators of Mexico's prehistory deny that Quetzalcoatl had white physical traits, end quote, and citing an academic work published in 1962. So Hancock's 1995 book was less informed and less accurate on this topic than the work of an explicit racist published in 1972. In 1968, journalist and author Daniel Cohen's book, Secrets from Ancient Graves, Rulers and Heroes of the Past Whose Lives Have Been Revealed Through Archaeology, challenged the white Quetzalcoatl myth directly, writing, quote, the stories concerning Quetzalcoatl's white skin are questionable. They were all collected by the Spanish. The Spanish were eager to legitimize their conquest and may have interpreted Quetzalcoatl's white robe as a white skin. Or they simply may have misunderstood what the Indians told them. On the other hand, the Indians must have been eager to please their new masters by telling them what they wanted to hear. End quote. Cohen's book was published by an average trade press for a popular audience, and so would have been accessible to consumers at the average bookshop. This review of evidence from 1990 to 1968 has shown that Dan was wrong to say the myth of a white Quetzalcoatl was only, quote, recently debunked, end quote, and that there was no way for Hancock to have found this information, quote, unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia, end quote. It was out there for anyone to find, and plenty of perfectly average writers managed to find it even outside academia. As a journalist, there's no reason why Hancock couldn't have found information which non-professional authors managed to find. No internet is no excuse for poor research. In addition to his unsubstantiated claim that it was too difficult for Hancock to have discovered that the white Quetzalcoatl was a myth, quote, unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia, end quote, Dan also claims that information access in the early 90s limited Hancock's ability to find the facts, stating, quote, it's not like he could just go Google it and get on Google Scholar. It's the freaking 90s, man. Early 90s, end quote. A glance at Fingerprints of the Gods' lengthy 5-page bibliography, which lists a wide range of works published as early as the 17th century and as recently as 1991, and which includes both pop history works and academic publications, does not give the impression that Hancock found it hard to find sources for his book despite the lack of internet access. Now, as someone who was using the internet back in the early 90s, I agree it was very limited at the time, and absolutely nothing like the information superhighway it would become later. However, as someone who was doing academic research at that time, both at university and for myself, I can assure you that digital information sources were available which made information gathering far easier than in the past, and enabled the average person to obtain information from scholarly sources such as academic journals and books. One method was an electronic article index, typically stored on a CD-ROM, used in a computer which might be located at a university or a local public library. This allowed users to search the names and abstracts of hundreds of thousands of journal articles to find articles published on topics they were researching. It was not a full text database, those weren't widely available until some years later, so it couldn't provide the entire article, but it did provide an abstract telling you what the article was mainly about, and it provided the publication details so you could ask your university or public librarian to see if they had a hard copy of the journal issue containing the article you wanted. If they didn't, they could often order it from another library via interlibrary loan, and you could do the same for books. Another method was microfilm. This was used extremely widely as an information storage and retrieval medium by libraries from at least the 1960s, and it's still used today since it's incredibly tough. It can outlast paper, CD-ROMs, hard drives, flash memory, magnetic tape, and pretty much any other form of digital storage. High-quality microfilm under correct storage conditions can last well over 500 years and even up to 1,000. Microfilm reels stored entire journals on long spools of thin plastic sheet printed with the journal's text at a very small scale. A microfilm reader printer could read these reels with a magnifying lens and print out hard copies using photocopier technology. Microfilm reels were cheap, compact, robust, and safe to send by mail, and were thus easily shared between libraries via interlibrary loan at a very small cost to the borrower. I remember borrowing microfilm reels from my local library, which I had requested via interlibrary loan from the National Library of Australia. These reels had been produced in Michigan in the 1970s and contained scans of hundreds of books dating from the 16th to the 18th centuries, an incredible wealth of information available to any member of the public via a simple request at a local library. So the early 90s wasn't an information wasteland, and there were plenty of academics and members of the public using simple but effective tools to find information on a wide range of subjects. And remember, the sources Hancock could have used to gain more accurate information, especially on the topic of the white Quetzalcoatl myth, weren't locked up in academic collections or hidden in obscure scholarly publications inaccessible to the public. They were readily available at average bookshops carrying pop history publications. The fact is, this information wasn't at all hard to find in the early 90s. Hancock just didn't look diligently for it. Again, remember, Hancock was a journalist for 20 years, so there's no reason why he would have been less competent at finding information and checking sources than the average person. As a journalist, he would have had access to far more sources than the average person and had the skills to differentiate between high and low quality sources. Conclusion. If you spend enough time watching Dan's videos, you'll notice a trend of him making bold statements for which he never provides evidence. I don't mean he provides weak evidence or evidence I consider inadequate. I mean no evidence whatsoever. When he tells us the discrediting of the white Quetzalcoatl, quote, wasn't something that was taught until recently, until very recently, end quote, and that, quote, when Hancock wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, unless he was really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia, there's no way for him to have stumbled across it, end quote, he doesn't cite any evidence for this at all. He just says it and expects us to accept it at face value. But I don't think that's good enough, especially when he's making a claim on behalf of Hancock, which Hancock himself never even made. So I'd like Dan to cite his sources for this claim, show the evidence that this claim is true, substantiate this claim with proof. Is this a conclusion at which Dan arrived after looking into the matter, after assessing various sources, after cross-checking with Hancock, and after confirming the facts? If so, the sources should be readily identifiable. There's something else I find very telling about Dan's statement. If Dan really believes Hancock wouldn't have known this unless he was, quote, really into those kinds of studies in a high level of academia, end quote, then he's tacitly acknowledging that pseudo-historians like Hancock need to check their facts against current scholarship and acknowledging that the expertise of the Academy is more likely to be reliable than the research of the enthusiastic amateur. I think Dan should think about that.